My name is Olivia, I'm 33 years old, and I'm an assistant conservator at the British Museum. Tonight, staring at our shared iPad in our cramped archway flat, I'm discovering that my husband has been lying to me for 6 months. I'd only picked it up to check our Tesco delivery time, nothing suspicious, just the mundane rhythm of our shared life. Instead, I found a calendar notification that would unravel everything. Dinner, Hawksmoor, 7 p.m, Friday. That was our wedding anniversary, the same night James told me he'd be working late on a pitch, and my chest tightened as reality settled over me like cold water, my breath becoming shallow and painful. I knew, even before I opened his messages, what I would find, because perhaps I'd always known on some level I'd refused to acknowledge. The late nights that smelled of unfamiliar perfume, the way he flinched when I touched him, the distance that had grown between us like frost creeping across glass, so gradual I'd convinced myself it was normal, that all marriages went through these quiet winters where intimacy died by degrees. I opened the messages and found months of exchanges with someone saved as A, my finger scrolling mechanically as each line delivered a small, precise cut. Can't wait to see you Friday, followed by he suspects nothing, and then you make me feel alive again, as if I'd been killing him slowly with my presence, my career, my existence. I scrolled further back through 6 months of careful deception, 6 months while I stayed late cataloguing Tudor manuscripts under dim lighting, my back aching, 6 months while I apologized for being tired and working too much, 6 months while I wondered why my husband of 8 years looked through me as if I were made of glass. The flat suddenly felt suffocating, our cramped 2-bedroom with its peeling paint and perpetual damp smell, the place we'd moved into at 25 promising it was temporary. 8 years later we were still here, and I was still making myself smaller to fit his vision of who I should be. My phone buzzed. Don't wait up. Pitch running long X. That casual lie broke something fundamental inside me, not my heart, which had been cracking for months, but my willingness to pretend, to be reasonable Olivia who never made a fuss or demanded honesty from the man who'd promised to love her. I began taking screenshots methodically, preserving every message and photo, my hand steady with clinical precision. This was conservation work really, documenting what existed before it could be destroyed or denied, creating an archive of betrayal that couldn't be explained away. Then I did something the old Olivia would never have dared, finding the woman's full name in James's contacts, Annabelle Foster, marketing manager at his firm. Of course they'd met at that corporate retreat in March, the one he'd returned from distant and irritable, picking fights about my obsessive museum work. Facebook revealed her curated life, glossy, laughing in expensive restaurants, and 3 years back, a wedding photo beside David Foster, 35, a pediatric nurse at Great Ormond Street with kind eyes, someone who hadn't learned to expect betrayal yet. My finger hovered over the message button as I wrestled with whether this was madness, contacting a stranger to tell him his wife was sleeping with my husband. But something had shifted, and the old Olivia who would have confronted James privately, probably apologizing for snooping, had been replaced by someone who wanted truth and witnesses. I typed quickly, "We need to talk about our spouses. Tomorrow. Please. My name is Olivia, I'm married to James Fletcher, and I believe our partners are having an affair." The message disappeared as I sat surrounded by his things, his chipped mug, his jacket on the chair, his life layered over mine until I'd forgotten where I ended and he began. My phone lit up faster than expected. I knew something was wrong. Where and when? David Foster had been waiting, just as I had, for someone to confirm what he already suspected. I sent details for a cafe in Hackney the following afternoon. As I pressed send, keys rattled in the lock and James walked in earlier than expected, dropping his bag with the casual confidence of someone whose lies were still working. "You're still up," he said, and I could read every tell, the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, the defensive shoulders, the guilt he wore like an ill-fitting coat. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice steady. "How was work?" "Exhausting, the clients being difficult," he said, and the lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly I wondered how many I'd swallowed over the years. He moved toward the bedroom and I stood, walked to him, and kissed him goodnight, tasting nothing but ash on his cold lips. "Happy anniversary, by the way," I whispered against his cheek. "Friday. 8 years." He froze for a heartbeat. Christ, I'd forgotten. "I'm sorry, Liv. Work's been mental," but I interrupted gently, using that nickname I'd always hated. "It's fine, We can celebrate another time, I said, watching relief flood his face as he mumbled agreement and empty love that meant nothing. I watched him disappear into our bedroom, then returned to the kitchen where the iPad still glowed. Tomorrow I would meet David Foster and decide what truth looked like. Tonight, alone in the ruins of my marriage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not resignation, but fury, cold and clarifying and absolutely freeing. 3 days later I found myself standing outside a cafe in Hackney with my hands shoved deep in my coat pockets to stop them trembling. I'd spent those days moving through my life like an actress playing the role of Olivia, smiling at colleagues and cataloguing manuscripts with mechanical precision and sleeping beside James while feeling the space between us like an ocean. David Foster was already inside when I arrived. He sat at a corner table with an untouched coffee going cold in front of him, and I recognized him immediately from the wedding photo, though the man before me looked hollowed out. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd slept as little as I had. He stood when he saw me and we shook hands like business associates meeting to discuss something far less devastating than the implosion of our marriages. "Thank you for coming," I said as I slid into the seat across from him. My voice was steadier than I felt. I wasn't sure you would, or if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing and convinced myself of something that wasn't real. "I've been watching my wife lie to me for 3 months, David replied quietly as his fingers tightened around his mug. "I'm a pediatric nurse at Great Ormond Street, which means I'm trained to notice the things most people miss, changes in heart rate and pupil dilation and the way someone breathes when they're not telling the truth. Annabelle's been coming home smelling different, not perfume exactly but just not like herself, and when I asked about her evenings her pupils would dilate slightly before she answered." The clinical precision of his observation broke something in me. This kind man had been methodically documenting his own betrayal like a scientist recording data. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots I'd taken, then watched his face as he scrolled through months of messages between his wife and my husband. "They met at a corporate retreat in March," I explained in a voice that was flat and factual, as if I were explaining the provenance of a damaged manuscript rather than the destruction of everything I'd built. 6 months of this while I stayed late at the museum thinking I was building my career, while he picked fights about how I was never home or available or choosing him over my work. David looked up from the phone with an expression somewhere between rage and devastation. "She came back from that retreat and started a fight about how I never challenged her or excited her, how I was too safe and boring and content with our ordinary life. I thought she was stressed about work or about turning 30 or about whether we should start trying for children." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out she was just looking for an excuse to justify what she'd already started." We sat in silence for a moment as two strangers united by betrayal. I found myself studying his face properly for the first time and noticing a gentleness to him that felt foreign after years with James. There was a quietness that didn't feel like weakness but rather like strength held in reserve. He caught me looking and offered a sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Do you want to scream?" he asked suddenly. "Because I've wanted to scream for months, but I kept thinking maybe I was wrong or paranoid or somehow the problem." "I don't want to scream," I said slowly as the words formed and crystallized into certainty. "I want them to see us. I want to walk into that restaurant on Friday and watch their faces when they realize they're not invisible anymore, that their choices have witnesses and that we exist and we know and we're done pretending." David leaned forward and his voice dropped lower. "What happens after we confront them?" "I honestly don't know," I admitted, and it felt liberating to say it out loud and acknowledge that I had no plan beyond Friday. No plan beyond the moment when James would have to look at me and see what he'd done. But I know I can't keep making myself smaller. I've spent 8 years apologizing for taking up space and being good at my job and existing fully in the world. I'm done with that. "I've spent 3 years being safe, David," he said quietly. "The reliable one who never caused drama because Annabelle said she wanted security after her chaotic ex-boyfriend. Turns out she wanted the chaos more than she wanted me." We exchanged a look that held more understanding than words could carry. I felt something shift in my chest, some small easing of the terrible loneliness I'd been carrying. Here was someone who understood and who was living inside the same nightmare and who knew what it felt like to watch someone you loved become a stranger. "Thank you," David said as we stood to leave, and when I looked at him questioningly he added, for the message and for confirming I wasn't going mad and for being brave enough to reach out. "We'll be brave together," I replied with a firmness in my voice that surprised me. Friday. Hawksmoor. 7 o'clock. Friday arrived like an execution date. I spent the day at the museum moving through conservation work with mechanical precision while my mind played out 1,000 versions of what would happen tonight. My hands trembled as I cleaned a 16th-century letter with a cotton swab, and my supervisor asked twice if I was feeling well. I lied and said I was fine, which had become my default state, lying about being fine while everything inside me screamed. I met David outside Hawksmoor in Knightsbridge at 6:30. He wore a navy suit that looked slightly too big for him, as if he'd lost weight in the days since we'd met, and his face was pale under the street lamps. We didn't speak at first, just stood together in the November cold watching well-dressed couples drift past us into the restaurant's warm golden glow. "We can still leave," David said quietly without looking at me. "We could just go home and pretend we never found out and keep living our lives the way they were." "Could you really do that?" I asked, and when he finally met my eyes I saw the answer there before he spoke. "No," he admitted. "I don't think I could look at myself in the mirror anymore if I did." The Maître d' seated us at our table with professional efficiency. The restaurant was beautiful in that understated expensive way, dark wood and soft lighting and the scent of charred meat and red wine. Our table was positioned perfectly, close enough to see and hear everything at the adjacent table where James had made his reservation. I sat with my back to the entrance so I wouldn't have to watch them arrive, wouldn't have to see the moment before they saw me. David ordered wine neither of us would drink. His leg bounced under the table with nervous energy and I found myself reaching across to touch his hand, just briefly, a gesture of solidarity that steadied us both. We were in this together now, two people who'd been made invisible by the ones who were supposed to love them, and tonight we were taking back our right to be seen. I heard James's laugh first. That deep rumble I used to love, now just the sound of someone who thought he was getting away with something. Then a woman's voice, bright and flirtatious. "You're terrible, you know that?" My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought David must be able to hear it. The rustle of coats being removed, the scrape of chairs, the intimate murmur of voices pitched low for private conversation. I counted to 10 and felt each number like a heartbeat. Then I turned in my seat. James was reaching across the table with his hand covering Annabelle's on the white linen cloth. The same hand that hadn't reached for me in months, that had pulled away when I tried to hold it during films or across our own dinner table. He wore the shirt I'd bought him for his birthday and the watch his parents gave him when we got married. Our eyes met. The entire restaurant seemed to stop. Not literally, of course, the clatter of cutlery and murmur of conversation continued around us, but in the space between James and me the world contracted to a single point of recognition. I watched the color drain from his face as understanding hit him. I knew, I was here, this was happening. His hand jerked back from Annabelle's as if he'd been burned. Annabelle followed his gaze and her mouth opened in a perfect circle of shock. She looked younger than her photos, her glossy hair and careful makeup suddenly making her seem vulnerable rather than threatening. She saw David and something crumbled in her expression, guilt and panic and the dawning realization that her comfortable lies had just shattered. I spoke first, pitching my voice just loud enough to carry across the small distance between our tables. "Happy anniversary, darling." The word darling was a knife wrapped in silk. "Aren't you going to introduce us to your colleague?" James half stood from his chair and knocked his napkin to the floor. His face had gone through shock and was settling into something like panic mixed with desperate calculation. "Olivia, I can explain," he started, but I cut him off with a voice I'd never used with him before, cold and absolutely certain. "Sit down, James." He Saturday. I'd never commanded him to do anything in 8 years of marriage, had always asked and suggested and apologized for wanting, and the novelty of my tone seemed to short-circuit his ability to argue. David spoke next, his voice quiet but carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. "Hello, Annabelle. Finished at the gym early tonight?" The Maître d' approached our tables, clearly sensing something wrong in the atmosphere. I smiled at him with the polished professional warmth I used when giving tours to museum donors. What a wonderful coincidence, running into friends like this. Would you mind terribly pushing our tables together? We'd love to catch up properly. He hesitated, his trained hospitality instincts warring with the obvious tension, but my smile didn't waver and eventually he nodded. Within minutes we were seated at a combined table, David and I on one side, James and Annabelle on the other, like some perverse double date orchestrated by fate's cruelest sense of humor. A waiter appeared with menus. No one looked at them. James tried again, his voice pitched low as if we were having a private conversation rather than sitting in a restaurant full of witnesses. This isn't what it looks like. It looks like you're having dinner with your mistress on our wedding anniversary, I interrupted, and I marveled at how steady my voice was, how calm I sounded when inside I was screaming. At a restaurant you booked 3 weeks ago while telling me you'd be working late. So please, James, tell me what I'm misunderstanding about this situation. He had no answer. His mouth opened and closed silently, and I felt a vicious satisfaction at watching him flounder. Annabelle found her voice, and it came out defensive and sharp. You clearly weren't meeting his needs if he had to look elsewhere for companionship. The words hung in the air for a moment before David laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor at all. That's your justification? I work 60-hour weeks at a children's hospital. I come home exhausted and still ask about your day and still cook dinner and still try to be present. When was the last time you asked me anything that wasn't about yourself or your work or your dissatisfaction with our boring life? That's not fair, Annabelle started, but David wasn't finished. I found hotel receipts from Brighton, he said, pulling out his phone with hands that only shook slightly. The weekend you said you were at a marketing conference. James was supposedly at a client meeting that same weekend. Funny how your lies lined up so perfectly. James's face had gone grey. He reached for his water glass and I watched his hand tremble. You've been tracking me, he asked, trying for outrage but landing somewhere closer to pathetic. I've been paying attention, I corrected him, echoing David's words. Something you stopped doing about 2 years ago. When I got the fellowship at the British Museum and suddenly my career was obsessive and I was never home even though I was home every evening while you were supposedly working late. You chose the museum over us, James tried, but I cut through his deflection like a scalpel. There was no us to choose, James. There was me trying to be enough while you resented me for not being less. For not making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. The truth sat between us now, ugly and undeniable. This wasn't about love or passion or two people finding connection. This was about ego and validation and two people who'd married for the wrong reasons and chosen to betray rather than be honest about their unhappiness. Annabelle was crying now, mascara tracking down her careful makeup. James looked at her with something that might have been concern or might have been panic about his own situation. Neither of them looked at their actual spouses. I stood, placing my napkin on the table with careful precision. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I'm filing for divorce on Monday. Your things will be in boxes by the weekend. Don't come home tonight, James. I walked toward the exit, and after a heartbeat I heard David's chair scrape back as he followed me, leaving James and Annabelle sitting in the wreckage of their comfortable lives with a restaurant full of witnesses and no more shadows to hide in. Outside, the November rain fell cold and sudden, and I made it exactly 3 steps from the restaurant before my legs gave out. I didn't cry, I made a sound I didn't recognize, something deeper than sobbing, a keening noise that came from somewhere animal and raw. The pavement was wet under my knees and I couldn't seem to remember how to stand. David caught my elbow and steadied me against the restaurant's brick wall. His face was blurred through the rain streaming down my face, or maybe I was crying after all and couldn't tell the difference anymore. I've got you, he said quietly, his hand warm and solid on my arm. I've got you, just breathe. We walked with no destination through rain-slicked streets that reflected neon and street lamps in fractured colors. My expensive dress was soaked through and my shoes rubbed blisters on my heels, but I couldn't seem to care about anything beyond putting one foot in front of the other. David stayed beside me without speaking, and eventually we found ourselves at the South Bank, standing at the railing and looking out over the Thames. The river was black glass reflecting the city's scattered lights. A tourist boat passed beneath us with its windows bright and full of people laughing and drinking and having the kind of normal evening I couldn't imagine ever having again. I watched it disappear under Waterloo Bridge and felt the absurd urge to laugh at how completely my life had shattered. 8 years, I whispered into the rain. I gave him 8 years of my life. I turned down a position in Edinburgh because he said long distance wouldn't work. I stopped seeing friends he found pretentious. I apologized constantly for being good at my job, for caring about my work, for existing in a way that made him feel small. David was quiet for a long moment before speaking. 3 years for me, but I think I knew from the start that I was a placeholder. She used to talk about her ex constantly, the spontaneous one, the exciting one who took her to music festivals and surprised her with weekend trips. I was mature and stable and safe, which I thought were compliments until I realized they were character flaws. When did you stop feeling like enough? I asked, turning to look at him properly. Rain had plastered his hair to his forehead and his suit was ruined, but his eyes were clear and sad and somehow still kind despite everything. About 6 months into the marriage, he admitted. She made a comment at dinner with her friends about how I was the sensible choice after years of chaos. Everyone laughed like it was charming, but I saw how she looked at me like I was a safety net she'd settled for. You. Year 3, I think. James made a joke at a dinner party about me being the clever one in the relationship, said it in this tone that made it sound like an affliction. Everyone laughed and I laughed too, and later when I tried to tell him it hurt he said I was being too sensitive. I looked back at the river. After that I started making myself smaller bit by bit. Stopped talking about work at social events. Stopped correcting him when he got facts wrong. Stopped taking up space. We stood in silence watching the rain dimple the river's surface. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my bag, probably James, probably full of explanations and justifications and demands that I be reasonable. I ignored it. What happens now? David asked eventually. After tonight, after we go home to empty flats, after the anger fades and we're just left with the wreckage. Now we figure out who we are, I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke them. When we're not performing for people who weren't even watching. When we're not trying to be enough for people who were always going to find us lacking. When we stop letting their failure to see our worth determine how we see ourselves. David nodded and we stood together as the rain began to ease. A night bus rumbled past on the street behind us. Somewhere in the distance Big Ben chimed midnight, though I'd lost all sense of time somewhere between the restaurant and here. Can I have your number? David asked. Properly, I mean. Not just for coordination but because I think you might be the only person who understands what I'm going through. I saved his contact as David, real, and the addition made us both smile, small and sad. We shared a taxi back to our respective neighborhoods. He got out first in Bethnal Green, and before closing the door he turned back to me. You were always enough, Olivia, he said quietly. He just wasn't looking. The taxi pulled away and I watched him disappear into the rainy night. When I finally got home the flat was empty. James had listened to at least one instruction. I found our shared iPad still open to his messages and spent the next hour methodically screenshotting everything for my solicitor while my wet dress dripped puddles on the kitchen floor and my hands finally stopped shaking. The divorce was startlingly simple. My solicitor, a sharp woman in her 50s named Ruth, looked over our paperwork and raised an eyebrow. Married young, no children, no shared property beyond a rented flat and some furniture. Separate bank accounts. She glanced up at me. You kept your finances separate. He complained about my frivolous spending, I explained, remembering the arguments about museum cafe lunches and second-hand books. Said I needed to be more responsible with money. Ruth's expression told me everything about what she thought of that. This should be straightforward then. 6 months and you'll be free. James tried negotiation first. Long text messages about how we could work through this, how every marriage had rough patches, how he'd made a mistake but we had history together. I blocked his number after the 5th message. Then he tried showing up at the museum, waiting outside the staff entrance with that puppy dog expression that used to work on me. I walked past him without speaking and had security escort him from the premises. His final attempt was anger. A solicitor's letter demanding half the value of my personal possessions, claiming I'd been emotionally unavailable throughout our marriage. Ruth handled it with surgical precision, responding with a counterclaim for emotional damages and a reminder that adultery remained adultery regardless of his justifications. He signed the papers 2 weeks later. I found a room in a flat share in Peckham with 2 PhD students from UCL who spent their evenings arguing about medieval poetry over cheap wine. My room was tiny with a window that overlooked a small garden, and I could hear every conversation through the thin walls, but it was mine. I hung my botanical sketches on the walls and arranged my books on second-hand shelves, and for the first time in years I could breathe without apologizing for taking up oxygen. Work became my anchor in ways it had never been before. The British Museum acquired a collection of Elizabeth I correspondence, letters that had been water-damaged and nearly illegible, and I was assigned as lead conservator. It was the opportunity I'd been working toward for years, the kind of project that could define a career, and I threw myself into it with an intensity that felt like salvation. I stayed late most nights carefully revealing words written 450 years ago by a queen who'd navigated betrayal and politics and survived. There was something healing about the meticulous work, the patience required, the way damaged things could be preserved and understood even if they couldn't be returned to their original state. My supervisor noticed the change during a progress review. "You've found your confidence," she said, studying my latest conservation report. "Have I?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "You're not apologizing anymore. For taking up space, for having opinions, for being brilliant at your work. What changed?" "I stopped performing for an audience of one," I said, and she nodded like that made perfect sense. David and I met weekly, falling into an easy pattern of coffee in Borough Market or walks along Regent's Canal. We talked about everything, the logistics of separation, the strange relief of empty flats, the panic attacks that hit at unexpected moments. He told me about Annabelle's solicitor demanding half his savings despite her affair. I told him about waking at 3 in the morning convinced I'd made a terrible mistake, that being alone was worse than being diminished. "My therapist says I need to relearn how to trust myself," David mentioned one Saturday afternoon as we fed ducks near Victoria Park. "That before I can trust anyone else, I need to trust my own judgment again." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "That I already do. I trusted my judgment the night I followed you out of that restaurant." He glanced at me with a small smile. "Best decision I've made in years." 3 months after the restaurant, I received an email about a Conservation Award nomination for my work on the Tudor manuscripts. I read it 3 times before believing it was real, then sat at my tiny desk in my tiny room and felt something unfamiliar, pride, uncomplicated by guilt or the need to make myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I called David. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me something good." "I've been nominated for the Pilgrim Trust Conservation Award," I said, hearing the wonder in my own voice. His joy was immediate and generous and completely genuine. "Olivia, that's incredible. When's the ceremony?" "I'm coming, obviously." After we hung up I sat in my small room listening to my flatmates debate Chaucer through the thin walls, and I realized I was smiling. A real smile, the first in what felt like years. The Conservation Award ceremony was held at the Wallace Collection, a Georgian townhouse museum in Marylebone that smelled of beeswax polish and centuries. I wore a vintage dress from Portobello Market, deep blue velvet that I'd never have chosen when I was married because James would have called it too dramatic. Now it felt exactly right. David met me outside holding a small bouquet of tulips. "Too much?" he asked, suddenly shy. "They're perfect," I said, taking them and feeling absurdly touched by the gesture. Inside, the room filled with colleagues and academics and people who'd watched my work for years. When my name was called I walked to the podium on steady legs, no longer apologizing for taking up space or achieving things. My speech was brief. Conservation is about revealing what's hidden beneath damage. Layer by layer, with patience and care, we discover what was always there. The beauty doesn't come from us, we only remove what obscures it. I paused, meeting eyes around the room. I think there's a lesson in that for all of us. The applause was generous. I saw David in the 3rd row clapping hard with genuine pride on his face, and something warm settled in my chest. Afterward, there was wine and conversation that flowed without me second-guessing every word. An older conservator from the Victoria and Albert Museum pulled me aside. I watched you present 5 years ago at a symposium. You were brilliant, but you kept apologizing for your conclusions. Tonight you were just brilliant. What changed? I stopped asking permission to exist, I said, and she nodded as if that was the most natural thing in the world. Walking out into the April evening, David beside me, I felt lighter than I had in years. He was telling me about a difficult case at the hospital, a 7-year-old with leukemia who'd asked if David would still visit after discharge. I gave her my email address, he said. Technically against protocol, but some things matter more than rules. We stopped on a quiet street near Regent's Park. Street lamps cast amber pools on the pavement and the air smelled of spring rain and new leaves. David turned to face me and his expression was serious. I need to tell you something, he said. My heart kicked against my ribs. All right. I've developed feelings for you. Real, complicated, terrifying feelings. He was looking at his shoes rather than at me. And I need you to know I won't act on them unless you feel the same. Even then, only when you're ready. You're one of the most important people in my life and I won't risk that. The words hung between us in the warm evening air. I'd felt it too, had been feeling it for weeks, the way my day improved when he texted, how I stored up stories to tell him, the warmth that spread through my chest when he laughed at my terrible puns about medieval manuscripts. But was it real or just two wounded people clinging to each other? Was it too soon? Too complicated? Too risky? I need time, I whispered. To be sure. To be ready. To know this isn't just. Take all the time you need, he interrupted gently, finally meeting my eyes. I'm not going anywhere. I just needed you to know. He kissed my forehead, soft and brief, then stepped back. Text me when you get home. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He smiled, small and sad and hopeful, then turned and walked toward the tube station. I stood alone on the quiet street touching where his lips had brushed my skin, terrified and exhilarated and wondering if healing meant opening yourself to hurt again or if that was simply what it meant to be alive and willing to try. The night bus home felt surreal, passing through London streets full of Friday night crowds. I watched couples holding hands and groups of friends laughing and solitary figures staring at phones, all of us moving through our separate narratives that sometimes intersected in unexpected ways. When I got back to my flat in Peckham, my flatmates were having one of their wine-fueled debates about Chaucer. I made tea and joined them, letting their passionate argument about the wife of Bath wash over me while I thought about David's confession and my own tangled feelings and the person I was becoming in the spaces between who I'd been and who I might yet be. 6 weeks passed in a strange suspension between my old life and whatever came next. I thought about David constantly, his steadiness, his kindness, the way he saw me completely and didn't flinch. But I also thought about James's initial kindness, before resentment curdled it into something toxic. How could I trust that this wasn't just comfort, two damaged people clinging to each other in the wreckage? Therapy helped. Miranda, my therapist, had a way of asking questions that bypassed my careful rationalizations and hit something truer underneath. When you're with David, do you feel like you have to perform? She asked during one session. No, I said immediately. Do you apologize for your successes when you tell him about them? I stopped, thinking about telling him about the award nomination and how his joy had been instant and generous. No. He celebrates them. Does he ask you to be smaller, quieter, less than you are? Never. He makes space for me. He asks my opinion and actually listens to the answer and remembers what I say. I looked at her. So my fear isn't that he's like James. What is your fear then? That I'll become who I was in that marriage. That I'll start making myself smaller again because that's what I learned to do. Miranda leaned forward. You're not that person anymore, Olivia. You didn't lose yourself, you found yourself. No one can take that away unless you give them permission. The revelation sat in my chest like a lit match, small and bright and burning away the last traces of my hesitation. That evening I invited David to dinner at my flat share. I cooked Thai curry from my mother's recipe, something I'd stopped making because James called it too spicy. David arrived with wine and genuine interest in my flatmate's research on medieval women's writing, asking thoughtful questions that had them glowing with the pleasure of being taken seriously. After dinner we sat on my narrow bed, the only seating in my tiny room, with mugs of tea cooling between us. The sounds of my flatmates debating Marjorie Kemp filtered through the thin walls. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began. "After the award ceremony. You don't have to," David started, but I touched his hand to stop him. "Let me finish." I took a breath. "I'm terrified. Of being hurt again. Of losing myself again. Of this being a mistake born from shared trauma rather than something real." His face was carefully neutral, giving me space to speak without his emotions influencing mine. "But I'm more terrified of letting fear make my decisions," I continued. "I have feelings for you, David. Strong, real, complicated feelings that scare me because they matter. And I think we could be something genuine, something healthy, but I need to go slowly. No grand gestures, no moving in together, just us figuring out what this is." He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched emotions move across his face, relief and joy and understanding and something tender that made my chest ache. "Slow is perfect," he said finally. "We've got time, Olivia. We don't have to rush toward anything or prove anything. We can just be." "Do we really have time?" I asked. "I'm 33. You're 35. Aren't we supposed to have everything figured out by now?" He laughed softly. "I'm a pediatric nurse who's divorced before 36. My life plan exploded. But I'm happier now, in this tiny room with lukewarm tea, than I've been in years. Because I'm with someone who's actually here, who's present and real and brave enough to be honest about being scared." I kissed him. It was tentative and searching, a question more than a statement. He kissed back with careful reverence, his hands gentle on my face as if I were something precious that might break. When we pulled apart, breathless, I whispered, "This is terrifying." "Absolutely terrifying," he agreed, and kissed me again. Hours later we were tangled together on my narrow bed, fully clothed, talking about everything and nothing. His arm around my waist, my head on his chest, the sound of rain starting outside. Both of us healing, both of us whole, both of us choosing to be vulnerable again despite knowing exactly how much it could hurt. "Thank you," I said into the comfortable darkness. "For what?" "For being patient. For seeing me. For being brave enough to tell me how you felt even though I might have said no." He kissed the top of my head. "You're worth the risk, Olivia. You were always worth the risk." Outside, the rain fell steadily on Peckham's streets. My flatmates had finally gone to bed and the flat was quiet except for our breathing and the distant sound of a night bus rumbling past. I felt safe in a way I hadn't in years, not because David was protecting me but because I'd chosen this, chosen him, chosen to be open to possibility despite my fear. 14 months after the restaurant. The British Museum was hosting my exhibition, Hidden Voices, revealing Tudor women's letters, and the press coverage had been extraordinary. My painstaking conservation work had revealed correspondence that changed historical understanding of Elizabeth I court. BBC Radio 4 wanted an interview. The Guardian had run a profile. Tonight was the members' preview and I moved through the gallery answering questions with an ease that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. David stood near the back, deliberately unobtrusive. He'd learned that I shone brightest when I wasn't performing for anyone, when I was simply being myself. He caught my eye and smiled, small and proud, and something warm bloomed in my chest. Near the exhibition entrance I spotted a familiar figure and my first instinct was panic, old muscle memory. Then I breathed. James was here with Annabelle, who looked brittle in expensive clothes that didn't quite fit her properly. They were arguing in whispers, the kind of tense exchange I remembered too well. James noticed me watching. He approached alone, leaving Annabelle hovering awkwardly by a display case. Up close he looked older, or perhaps just tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Olivia. This is impressive," he said, gesturing at the exhibition. "Thank you. I had no idea you were working on something this significant." I almost laughed. "I told you. Repeatedly. 4 months. You weren't listening." Silence settled between us, uncomfortable and necessary. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "Letting you go." "No," I corrected gently. "You made a choice." "I made a mistake staying as long as I did, making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. But we're both better off now, I think. At least I am. David appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of wine, not staking a claim but simply present. He didn't introduce himself, just offered me a glass with that quiet smile I'd come to love. James's face did something complicated, recognition perhaps, from that night at the restaurant. "This is David," I said simply. "My partner." Not defensive. Not triumphant. Just fact. James nodded stiffly and retreated to where Annabelle waited. She hadn't said a word, hadn't even looked at me directly. They left shortly after, and I watched them go with something close to pity. They'd blown up 2 marriages for each other and seemed no happier for it. Was that difficult? David asked after they'd gone. It was fine, I said, surprised to find it was true. I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction. Just indifference. "That's the dream, isn't it?" he said. "To reach indifference." Later, after the crowds thinned, I stood alone before my favorite piece in the exhibition, a letter from 1586, barely legible when I'd first examined it. Now, under careful lighting, the words were clear. A woman writing to her sister about survival and resilience and hope despite terrible circumstances. David found me there. Ready to go. I turned to study his face, kind eyes behind rain-spotted glasses, the slight smile that had steadied me through panic attacks and legal proceedings and the slow terrifying work of learning to trust again. We'd been together properly for 7 months now, taking it slowly and carefully, building something real on honest foundations. "I was just thinking," I said, "about that night. The restaurant. How it felt like an ending. And now it feels like the beginning. Not of us necessarily, of me. The person I became when everything fell apart and I had to rebuild myself from the ground up." I took his hand. "But I'm glad you're here. In this beginning. In all the beginnings that come after." He kissed my temple. "Nowhere else I'd rather be." We left the museum together, stepping into a mild September evening. London traffic hummed its familiar song. Somewhere James was probably arguing with Annabelle about whose fault their unhappiness was. But I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about the manuscript waiting on my desk at work, 15th century, damaged, full of secrets waiting to be revealed. I was thinking about Sunday morning with David, our tradition of farmers' market croissants and terrible puns. I was thinking about the life I was building, layer by patient layer, revealing what had always been there beneath the damage. David said something that made me laugh, genuinely, fully, the sound echoing off the museum's stone columns. We walked into the evening hand in hand, 2 people who'd survived their own destruction and chosen, despite everything, to remain open to joy and hurt and all the messy beautiful complexity of being alive and willing to try. The story could have ended in that restaurant with betrayal and rage. Instead it began there, with a woman learning she was enough exactly as she was, and a man brave enough to see it. Everything after was just us, learning to be whole together without losing ourselves in the process.